Makes sense.
No.
Okay,
Last
come on.
time. Step out of this vehicle peacefully with me. Be a man about it.
Alright, so can we be
Step out peacefully.
No.
Be a man about it.
Right.
And let's deal with the consequences.
So,
Or I start yanking in you and get you out of here.
Get on the ground. Hands behind your back. Now. The command was issued outside a grocery store on Jefferson Avenue in Dayton, Ohio. Police lights reflected off the storefront windows and the parked cars in the lot. A man stood beside a dark gray sedan, holding his car keys. He was dressed in plain clothes. No uniform or visible badge identified him. The officer stepped closer, one hand resting on his holster. I said, get on the ground. The man did not move quickly enough. The officer took hold of his arm and forced him down. A knee was placed against the man's back as handcuffs were applied. Traffic continued to pass along the street. Several bystanders stopped and watched. The body-worn camera recorded the encounter without interruption. You're being detained, the officer said. The man asked a single question. For what? No answer was given. The officer tightened the handcuffs. At that moment, the officer did not know the identity of the man he had restrained. He did not know his profession, his position, or his authority. He did not know that the recording being made would later be reviewed in court. He did not know that the incident would become connected to a 66-year prison sentence. The camera continued recording. Earlier that evening, events had unfolded without incident. Ruth Coleman, a 72-year-old woman, had finished her shift at a church thrift store on West 3rd Street. She moved with the aid of a cane and had lived in Dayton for decades. People in the neighborhood recognized her and often greeted her by name. After work, she stopped at the same small grocery store she had used for years. The store had 2 checkout lanes and a narrow parking lot. She purchased bread, milk, and soup and paid in cash. As she exited the store, she noticed a man standing near a dark gray sedan. He was speaking on his phone in a calm tone. He wore jeans and a dark jacket. There was nothing unusual about his appearance. Ruth nodded as she passed him. He nodded in return. She opened her trunk and placed her groceries inside. Before closing it, she saw a police cruiser enter the parking lot and stop at an angle that partially blocked the exit. The emergency lights were activated, but the siren was not. Ruth paused. Police stops in the lot were not uncommon and were usually brief. The officer who stepped out of the cruiser was Daniel Mercer, age 38. He had served on the Dayton police force for 11 years and was working alone that night. Officer Mercer adjusted his duty belt and scanned the lot. His attention settled on the man near the gray sedan. The man ended his phone call and placed the device in his pocket. He did not attempt to leave. He remained where he was. Officer Mercer approached him. Hey, you, come here, the officer said. The man turned to face him. Yes, officer. Where are you headed? Home. Do you have identification? The man paused briefly. May I ask why? The officer's tone shifted. Because I'm asking. The man reached into his jacket slowly, removed his wallet, and held it out in front of him. Officer Mercer did not take it immediately. Step away from the car, the officer said. The man took 2 steps back. Ruth stood nearby, close enough to hear the exchange. She leaned slightly on her cane and watched. Officer Mercer walked around the man once and looked through the sedan's windows. What are you doing in this area? The officer asked. I live nearby, the man replied. The officer acknowledged the response but appeared unconvinced. Cars continued to enter and leave the lot. Customers walked in and out of the store. The situation remained controlled, though tense. Ruth spoke calmly. Officer, is everything all right? Officer Mercer turned toward her. Ma'am, please step back. Ruth complied, taking a step away while remaining in view. The officer turned back to the man. Keep your hands where I can see them. The man raised his hands. Officer Mercer used his radio. Dispatch. I have a male subject refusing to cooperate. Ruth reacted to the statement but did not interrupt. She had observed the interaction from the beginning. The dispatcher responded. Officer Mercer ended the transmission. "Turn around," the officer said. The man complied, turning slowly. Officer Mercer grabbed his arm without warning. The movement caused the man to lose his balance. He stumbled as the officer forced him against the vehicle. "Stop resisting," the officer said. "I'm not resisting," the man replied. The officer raised the man's arm higher. The man showed discomfort but did not shout. "Get on the ground," the officer ordered. The man hesitated briefly as he tried to steady himself. Officer Mercer forced him down onto the pavement. The impact was audible. The body-worn camera captured the man's face for a brief moment as he turned his head toward the lens. His expression remained controlled. Ruth spoke again, louder than before. "Officer, please." He wasn't doing anything. The officer did not respond. He placed a knee on the man's back and secured the handcuffs. Afterward, the officer lifted the man to his feet and escorted him to the cruiser. The man walked without resistance, his hands cuffed behind him. "Why am I being detained?" he asked again. "You'll find out," the officer said. The man was placed in the back seat, and the door was closed. The parking lot grew quiet. The emergency lights continued to flash. Officer Mercer returned to the sedan, looked inside once more, and made notes on a small pad. Ruth remained still, watching. The situation appeared unsettled but controlled. The officer eventually addressed her. "Ma'am, you can go." Ruth nodded. "I hope you treat people fairly," she said. The officer did not respond. Ruth left the parking lot. Inside the cruiser, the detained man sat upright and faced forward. He did not raise his voice or ask additional questions. Officer Mercer returned to the driver's seat and pulled onto the street. The body camera continued recording as the cruiser moved through the neighborhood. The officer spoke into his radio. "Dispatch, running ID now." The man's wallet rested on the front seat. The dispatcher responded. Officer Mercer read the name from the identification out loud. He did not pause or alter his tone. He continued driving toward the station. At that point, the officer had not yet acknowledged the significance of the information in front of him. Streetlights passed at regular intervals as the cruiser moved forward. The radio sounded again. Officer Mercer glanced down at the screen. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. The vehicle slowed slightly. The body camera continued recording as the situation shifted beyond an ordinary detention. Subscribe to stay updated, share to keep others safe, and comment where you're watching from. The patrol car slowed as Officer Daniel Mercer reviewed the information returned by dispatch. The transmission was brief and procedural, confirming the name, age, and status associated with the identification taken from the man's wallet. Officer Mercer did not speak after hearing it and continued driving toward the station. The man remained seated in the rear of the cruiser, upright and silent. His posture did not change, and his gaze stayed forward. The body-worn camera recorded the interior continuously. Several minutes passed without conversation. When the cruiser reached the Dayton Police Department's central holding facility, Officer Mercer parked in the intake area and shut off the engine. The emergency lights were turned off. He exited the vehicle and opened the rear door. "Step out," he said. The man complied and stepped out carefully, keeping his balance with his hands cuffed behind him. Officer Mercer guided him toward the entrance. Inside the station, activity was steady and controlled. Phones rang, and officers moved between desks. A booking officer stood behind the counter reviewing paperwork from a prior intake. Officer Mercer brought the man forward. "I have a detainee," he said. The booking officer looked up. "Charges." "Pending," Mercer said. "Possible obstruction." The man stood still while the booking officer reviewed the paperwork and examined the identification. The booking officer paused, looked again at the name, and then looked back at Officer Mercer. "This is the same individual?" he asked. "Yes," Mercer said. The booking officer returned to the screen and entered additional information. The area remained quiet aside from routine station sounds. The man spoke calmly. "I would like to contact my supervisor." The booking officer looked up. "Supervisor?" "Yes," the man said. "Through my department." Officer Mercer shifted his stance. "You'll have an opportunity to make calls later," he said. The booking officer continued entering information and did not intervene. The man was directed to a holding bench. His handcuffs remained on. This period passed without incident. Officers moved through the intake area, and no further use of force occurred. The environment remained procedural. After a short time, Sergeant Mark Holloway entered the intake area. He had been notified by dispatch to review a detention involving Officer Mercer. Sergeant Holloway approached the counter and examined the file displayed on the screen, reading silently. He looked at the man seated on the bench and then at Officer Mercer. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" Holloway said. The two officers stepped aside. Sergeant Holloway asked for the basis of the detention. Officer Mercer described the stop, citing suspicious behavior and a perceived lack of cooperation, using standard departmental language. Sergeant Holloway listened without interruption. When Mercer finished, Holloway returned to the screen and reviewed the associated records. At this point, the man's status had not been formally addressed in the room. No announcement was made, and no correction was issued. The process continued as a routine detention. Sergeant Holloway approached the bench. "Sir," he said, "can you confirm your current position?" The man responded directly, "Lieutenant." There was a brief pause. Sergeant Holloway nodded and returned to the counter. The handcuffs were removed shortly afterward. The man was not released and was instead escorted to a separate interview room. The interview room contained a table, 2 chairs, and a fixed camera in the corner. The man sat down, and the door remained open. Officer Mercer did not enter the room. Sergeant Holloway and Captain Elaine Turner reviewed the body-worn camera footage in a nearby office. They viewed the encounter from the initial approach through the detention. No commentary was recorded during the review. The timestamps aligned with dispatch logs. Captain Turner took notes. By the time the review concluded, the man had been seated in the interview room for more than 30 minutes. He remained still and did not request assistance. Captain Turner entered the room. "Lieutenant," she said, addressing him by rank, "we are reviewing the incident." The man acknowledged the statement without further comment. Captain Turner left the room. Later that night, the man was released without charges. No citation was issued, and he exited the station on his own. The body-worn camera footage had been logged and stored in accordance with department policy. In the weeks that followed, the footage was reviewed again as part of an internal review process. The review examined Officer Mercer's conduct, his statements, and the use of force. During that period, a formal complaint was filed alleging unlawful detention and excessive force. The complaint referenced the body-worn camera footage and dispatch records. The scope of the review expanded. Internal Affairs requested additional materials, including Officer Mercer's prior stop history and use of force reports. These records were collected and examined. As the process continued, requests for the footage were submitted through public records channels. The department delayed release pending the outcome of the internal investigation. Months later, the video was released. It documented the encounter in full, including the commands issued, the physical restraint, and the absence of explanation at the scene. Following the release, the department issued a brief statement confirming that an internal review had been conducted and that policies were being followed. No additional details were provided. Separately, prosecutors began examining the matter. Their review extended beyond the stop to include subsequent statements and actions taken during the internal process. Subpoenas were issued for internal communications. Additional evidence was added to the case file during this phase. The inquiry moved beyond departmental discipline and into a criminal investigation. Officer Mercer was notified that he would be required to provide a statement under oath. The statement was scheduled for a later date. Before that date, further evidence was entered into the record. The body-worn camera footage became a central piece of the investigation as the matter progressed toward formal legal proceedings. The request for Officer Daniel Mercer to provide a sworn statement marked a shift in how the matter was being handled. The review moved beyond internal policy compliance and into criminal evaluation. The focus expanded from departmental standards to potential violations of law. Officer Mercer was placed on administrative leave while the investigation continued. His service weapon was surrendered, and his access to departmental systems was restricted. These actions were documented and followed established procedures. Prosecutors reviewed the body-worn camera footage alongside dispatch logs, arrest documentation, and internal communications. Each item was logged and assigned reference identifiers. Using timestamps, investigators reconstructed the sequence of events across multiple sources. The footage showed that no clear reason for the detention was stated at the scene. It also showed that the man did not attempt to flee and complied with verbal instructions before physical force was applied. These observations were recorded in the investigative file. Investigators then reviewed Officer Mercer's prior service history. Records covering his 11-year tenure were requested, including traffic stops, field interviews, citizen complaints, and use of force reports. Each record was examined individually and then compared over time. Several prior complaints were identified. All had been closed without disciplinary action. The complaints involved allegations of unnecessary escalation during routine encounters. In each case, the findings cited insufficient evidence or conflicting accounts. Investigators noted repeated language patterns across reports. Descriptions of subjects as uncooperative or non-compliant appeared frequently. When available, these descriptions were compared against video recordings. These findings were documented and forwarded to prosecutors without summary conclusions. During this period, the lieutenant who had been detained remained on active duty within his own department. He did not issue public statements and cooperated with investigators through legal counsel. Ruth Coleman, who had witnessed the incident in the parking lot, was contacted and provided a formal statement. She described observing the officer's approach, the commands given, and the physical restraint. She stated that the man did not act aggressively and that the officer's actions appeared sudden. Her account aligned with key portions of the body-worn camera footage. Her statement was added to the case file. Internal emails between supervisory staff were reviewed. The messages discussed the stop, the existence of video footage, and potential public response if the recording became widely viewed. The communications focused on procedure and timing. Several messages referenced limiting exposure and managing the release of records. These emails were preserved as part of the evidentiary record. Several months after the incident, a grand jury was convened. Prosecutors presented body-worn camera footage, dispatch records, witness statements, and internal documents. Officer Mercer did not testify during the proceedings. The hearings were closed to the public. After deliberation, the grand jury returned an indictment. The charges included unlawful detention, false statements, and civil rights violations related to the use of force. The indictment was entered into the record. Officer Mercer was arrested without incident and processed according to standard procedure. He was released on bond later that day. Following the indictment, the department issued a brief public statement acknowledging the charges and confirming that Officer Mercer was no longer on active duty. The statement did not address specific allegations. The case proceeded through pretrial stages. Defense attorneys filed motions challenging interpretations of the body-worn camera footage and argued that the actions taken fell within discretionary authority. Prosecutors argued that the video and supporting records contradicted those claims. Evidentiary hearings were held. The court ruled that the body-worn camera footage was admissible in full. Dispatch recordings and internal emails were also admitted. Jury selection took place over several days. Prospective jurors were questioned regarding their views on law enforcement and video evidence. A jury was seated. At trial, prosecutors outlined the sequence of events, emphasizing the absence of a stated basis for detention and the use of force. Defense counsel focused on officer safety and situational judgment. Witnesses testified in sequence. Ruth Coleman testified regarding her observations in the parking lot. She described the officer's approach, the commands issued, and the physical restraint. She stated that the man did not act aggressively. Her testimony was consistent with prior statements. Dispatch personnel testified regarding radio communications and confirmed the timing of the identification check and the information returned to Officer Mercer. Supervisors testified about departmental policy, including standards governing detentions and use of force. They also described the internal review process. The lieutenant testified later in the proceedings. He described his actions during the encounter and his responses to commands. He stated that he did not resist and that he repeatedly asked for the reason for the detention. The body-worn camera footage was played multiple times during the trial. Jurors reviewed it in full and in segmented portions. After both sides rested, closing arguments were presented. The jury received instructions on the applicable law and began deliberations. Deliberations continued for several days. When the jury returned, verdicts were read into the record. Officer Mercer was found guilty on multiple counts related to the incident and subsequent actions. The case moved to sentencing. Prosecutors submitted recommendations based on statutory guidelines. Defense counsel argued for leniency, citing length of service and absence of prior criminal convictions. The court reviewed the pre-sentence report, departmental records, and submitted statements. At sentencing, the judge addressed the findings and cited the seriousness of the offenses and the misuse of authority. A sentence totaling 66 years was imposed and entered into the record. Officer Mercer was taken into custody following the hearing. Although sentencing concluded the trial phase, additional proceedings followed. Appeals were filed, and civil actions were initiated. The case continued beyond the verdict, extending into ongoing legal and institutional review. After sentencing, Officer Daniel Mercer was transferred from county custody to a state correctional facility. Intake records documented the length of the sentence and the counts on which he was convicted. His law enforcement certification was revoked, and his employment with the department was terminated in accordance with departmental policy. Defense counsel filed appeals shortly after the sentencing hearing. The filings challenged procedural rulings and the interpretation of evidence presented at trial, focusing on jury instructions, evidentiary decisions, and sentencing calculations. Prosecutors submitted responses defending the trial court's rulings and the jury's verdict. While the appeals process continued, related civil actions moved forward separately. The lieutenant who had been detained filed a federal civil rights lawsuit naming Officer Mercer, supervisory personnel, and the department. The complaint alleged unlawful detention, excessive force, and failures in supervision and training. It cited body-worn camera footage, dispatch logs, and internal communications that had already been introduced during the criminal proceedings. Depositions followed. Supervisors, dispatch staff, and internal affairs personnel testified under oath. Questioning addressed departmental practices, prior complaints involving Officer Mercer, and the department's handling of the incident after it occurred. During discovery, additional documents were produced, including training materials, internal policy updates, and correspondence related to the delayed public release of the video. These materials became part of the civil case record. The city later announced a settlement in the civil case. The terms included a financial payment and a statement acknowledging policy failures related to the incident. The settlement did not include an admission of wrongdoing by the city. The court approved the agreement, and the case was closed. At the same time, the department initiated a broader review of stop and detention practices. An external consulting firm was retained to assess use of force policies and supervisory protocols. The review examined compliance with body-worn camera requirements, reporting standards, and thresholds for escalation. Following that review, the department adopted several policy revisions. These included updated requirements for articulating cause during detentions, expanded supervisory review of use of force incidents, and additional training for encounters involving off-duty or plainclothes personnel. Public records procedures were also revised. Timelines for releasing body-worn camera footage were clarified, and approval authority was reassigned to reduce delays associated with internal review. No additional criminal charges were filed against other personnel involved in the incident. Ruth Coleman was informed of the outcomes of both the criminal case and the civil settlement. She did not participate further in legal proceedings. Her involvement remained limited to her witness statement and trial testimony. The lieutenant continued his career in public service. He declined media interviews and did not seek public attention. His name appeared only in court records and official filings related to the case. Over time, the incident was incorporated into training materials used in regional law enforcement programs. The body-worn camera footage was shown in controlled settings to illustrate decision-making during citizen encounters and the legal consequences of unlawful detention. Academic analyses and policy forums later referenced the case in discussions of accountability and oversight. These references focused on documented actions, institutional response, and the role of recorded evidence. Officer Mercer's appeals proceeded through the court system. Appellate judges reviewed trial transcripts, evidentiary rulings, and sentencing records. Written opinions addressed each claim raised by the defense. The convictions were upheld. With appellate review exhausted, the sentence remained in effect. The criminal case concluded without further modification. Years later, records associated with the case remained publicly accessible. The body-worn camera footage continued to be used in legal training and policy analysis. Departmental reports cited the incident as a basis for procedural changes. The grocery store on Jefferson Avenue remained in operation. The parking lot returned to routine use. No markers or signage indicated what had occurred there. The case remained part of the official record. It documented how a single detention, recorded in real time, progressed through internal review, criminal prosecution, civil litigation, and institutional reform. The record showed how video evidence, witness testimony, and documented decisions combined to determine outcomes within the legal system. The matter concluded without further proceedings, leaving a complete public record of the events, decisions, and consequences associated with that night.